Hey friends, tonight we're slipping into something far more comfortable: history. But not the kind with dusty dates and yawning generals. No, tonight we're talking about sleep. Or more specifically, the utterly bizarre, wonderfully weird ways medieval people approached it. So before you cocoon yourself under a blanket or nest into your favorite pillow fort, take a second to like this video and subscribe, only if you actually enjoy this strange little corner of the internet. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Where are you tuning in from and what time is it for you? There's something oddly soothing about knowing someone in Norway is nodding off at the same time as someone in New Zealand. Now let's set the scene. Dim the lights. Maybe flick on a fan or light a candle if you're feeling especially medieval chic. Let your screen glow softly like the embers of a forgotten hearth. This isn't just a lesson, it's a lullaby in the shape of forgotten facts and strange customs. Because before alarm clocks, blackout curtains, or TikTok-induced insomnia, people had a very different relationship with bedtime. A relationship that included segmented sleep, flea-ridden mattresses, midnight goat checks, and, believe it or not, sleepwalking spiritual crises. This isn't just boring history. It's a story about how people found rest in a world that never quite let them sleep. So fluff up your mental feather bed, grab your symbolic nightcap, and let's begin our journey into the strange, sacred, and occasionally itchy world of medieval sleep. Before sleep became a competition of who could hit 8 hours straight with a lavender diffuser and a calming podcast, it was something far stranger. In the medieval world, sleep came not in one neat, uninterrupted bundle, but in two distinct acts. Picture it as the Broadway production of unconsciousness. There was a first sleep, an intermission, and then the highly anticipated second sleep. This wasn't some rare quirk or weird village trend. This was the standard. If you were a monk in a cold stone cell, a farmer in a straw-stuffed hut, or even a noble with your own lumpy feather mattress, you likely slept in two shifts. The first began not long after sunset, because candles were expensive, and electricity was several centuries too late. People turned in early, dozing off into their first sleep, which lasted about 4 hours. That's Act 1. Then came the interlude, a phenomenon modern science calls the watch. And this is where things got fascinating. Around midnight, people would wake up. On purpose. Fully alert. No tossing and turning, no scrolling TikTok in despair because your brain won't shut up. Just awake as if sleep was a meeting you had temporarily stepped out of. But instead of wondering why you were awake, they leaned into it. This wasn't insomnia. This was prime time. So what did medieval folks do during this bewitching intermission? The answer is, more than you'd think. Some used this time to pray, whispering Latin psalms into the darkness like their soul's Wi-Fi was best at 2 a.m. Others read, if they could, or listened to someone else read scripture or saintly stories aloud. Tending fires was also common, because nothing wakes you up faster than the fear of freezing or accidentally burning your house down. And for the agriculturally inclined, checking on livestock was a top priority. If your goats were prone to existential crisis under moonlight, this was when you'd find out. Oh, and let's not forget intimacy. Medieval physicians and even marriage manuals advised that this midnight gap was an ideal time for couples to reconnect. According to them, it was when the body was well rested and the mind was calm. Translation: not too tired to move, not yet stressed about tomorrow's plowing. Very romantic. This was, in many ways, a deeply human rhythm, one that aligned perfectly with our natural circadian biology in a world without artificial light. The rise and fall of melatonin, the gentle cue of the moon rising over the thatched rooftops, all of it guided by nature's clock rather than an iPhone alarm. The second sleep began about 2 hours later and carried people through to dawn. That's when the chickens took over. Whether you were dreaming of sainthood or simply trying to stay warm beneath a pile of itchy wool, your body returned to slumber as though nothing unusual had happened. And when the sun peeked over the horizon, you rose, hopefully rested, hopefully without lice, and ready for another day of toil, prayers, and possibly stepping in cow dung before breakfast. Oddly enough, modern sleep science has circled back to this practice, suggesting that segmented sleep might actually be more natural for human beings than the rigid 8-hour marathon we idolize today. In the absence of artificial light, our ancestors may have been closer to a rhythm our brains still recognize, even if our schedules don't. So, the next time you find yourself lying awake at 2:13 a.m., don't panic. Don't reach for your phone. Just whisper softly into the dark. Ah yes, the watch has begun. And maybe go tend to your symbolic goat. Now that we've eased into the rhythm of segmented sleep and medieval midnight multitasking, it's time to look at where all this was happening, namely the bed. Or, to be more historically accurate, the medieval approximation of a bed, which ranged from just enough to not die, to heirloom feather-stuffed luxury. Spoiler alert, most people had the first one. Let's begin with the peasants. Their beds were as humble as their daily bread. Imagine a rectangle of straw, dumped onto a dirt or wooden floor, maybe shoved into a sack of coarse cloth if you were lucky enough to own such high-end technology. This creation, affectionately known as a pallet, was the medieval version of memory foam. If memory foam came with splinters, insect roommates, and occasional suspicious smells. And no, these weren't charming hay bales with rustic ambience. They were scratchy, often damp, and sometimes already claimed by livestock or rodents. You went to bed not for comfort but for survival. You hoped it would be warm, relatively clean, and free of the kind of creatures that might nibble on you while you dreamed of being someone else. These straw-filled nests were efficient in the way that only desperation can be. Straw was cheap, relatively insulating, and biodegradable, which was a fancy way of saying you just threw it out when it got too gross. It was also the perfect hiding spot for fleas, bedbugs, and field mice, nature's sleep interrupters since 5000 BCE. If something itched, you ignored it. If something bit, you rolled over and hoped for better luck on the other side. If you had a little money, or a functioning spine, you might elevate your mattress on a wooden frame. This did nothing for comfort, but at least it kept you off the ground, which was mildly safer and made it slightly less likely that a beetle would crawl directly into your ear. Progress. Now let's talk about linens, or the medieval lack thereof. You might think of fresh sheets, pillowcases, or a soft cotton duvet. Medieval folks had other ideas. Most people simply slept in the clothes they wore all day. Pajamas weren't a thing. Nightwear was just whatever you hadn't spilled soup on. If you owned a second tunic, congratulations, you were either wealthy or had amazing laundry timing. As for sleeping positions, you didn't stretch out starfish style and enjoy your personal blanket kingdom. You shared your bed. With everyone. Family members, children, maybe your grandmother, and possibly a visiting cousin or two. The goal wasn't coziness, it was body heat. Privacy wasn't a right. It was a fantasy. If someone rolled over and elbowed you in the face, that was the cost of not freezing to death. If you woke up tangled in someone else's limbs, that just meant your household was still alive and kicking. In colder months, you might even share your sleeping area with a chicken or two, or maybe the family dog who did not care about your boundaries but would keep your toes warm. Of course, nobles lived differently. If you were part of the elite, your bed was not just furniture. It was a status symbol. Large wooden frames, elaborately carved and draped with embroidered curtains and canopies, gave the appearance of comfort, even if the mattress was still uneven and suspiciously lumpy. Feather-stuffed mattresses were a luxury, passed down in wills like family treasure. But Aunt Matilda's feather bed? That was legacy. These beds were more than just sleeping surfaces, they were symbols of power and wealth. Some had carved initials, painted scenes, or crests. Others were surrounded by tapestries to block out drafts and hide the occasional scurrying rat. The more pillows you had, the fancier you were. The more feathers in your mattress, the closer you were to royalty, or a sneezing fit. Now let's address the fabulous, often overlooked accessory that defined medieval bedtime fashion: the nightcap. In our modern world, the phrase nightcap might conjure up images of whiskey, a crackling fire, and questionable texts. But in the Middle Ages, a nightcap was not a drink, it was a hat. A long, pointed, often ridiculous-looking piece of fabric designed to keep your head from freezing off in the middle of the night. You see, medieval buildings were many things: gloomy, drafty, sometimes on fire, but insulated was not one of them. Roofs leaked. Walls were cold. Windows were made of oiled parchment or thin horn, not glass. Central heating? That was called cuddling with a dog. So people turned to wool, linen, or anything soft enough to wrap around their heads. The iconic long stocking cap wasn't just stylish, it was survival. And yes, it made you look like a chimney sweep wizard, but it beat frostbite. For women, it sometimes doubled as a coif, preserving modesty and covering hair that hadn't seen a proper bath since last Lent. But nightcaps weren't just about warmth. They had social significance too. In some regions, married women were expected to keep their heads covered even while sleeping. And the nicer your cap, the better dyed or embroidered, the more prosperous your household appeared. Nothing said power couple like matching sleepwear that screamed, "We own 3 goats and a window that almost shuts." The nightcap also served a cultural purpose. If someone knocked at your door and you answered wearing one, that was the medieval way of saying, "I'm off duty. Kindly leave your nonsense for tomorrow." The hat said everything your mouth didn't need to. Speaking of sleepwear, we can't forget the nightshirt, that long, baggy tunic popularized by every illustration of Ebenezer Scrooge. These garments were rarely sexy but always practical, roomy enough to allow motion, long enough to avoid scandal, and made of materials that scratched just enough to remind you of your sins. In some cases they were reused robes or refashioned daywear. If it fit and wasn't actively on fire, it counted. Now let's talk about a situation that may make the introverts among us break out in historical hives. Sharing a bed with total strangers. That's right. If you were a traveling merchant, a pilgrim, or just someone whose mule gave up halfway to Norwich and you found an inn, it was cause for celebration. But don't expect a private room with a mint on the pillow. You didn't get a bed. You got a space in a bed. With other people. Strangers. Medieval inns worked more like human bunkhouses than hotels. A single bed might sleep 2, 3, even 4 people depending on its size and the innkeeper's enthusiasm for stuffing people in like sardines. If it was a big city, you might find yourself in a dormitory hall, shoulder to shoulder with dozens of snoring, twitching fellow travelers. You didn't get to choose your bedmate. Sometimes inns tried to sort guests by profession. Clergy with clergy, blacksmiths with blacksmiths, thieves with, well, each other, allegedly. But most of the time it was first come, first sprawled. Sleeping arrangements were not considered intimate. They were logistical. If the bed wasn't full, you filled it. If someone snored, you elbowed them. If someone talked in their sleep, you prayed they weren't cursed. If someone moved your bag, you were probably being robbed. People didn't complain. Not because they were okay with it, but because the alternative was sleeping outside, with wolves, rain, and the occasional peasant revolt. At least in the inn you had walls, warmth, and a slightly lower chance of freezing to death. To protect their belongings, travelers would tie purses to their belts or sleep on top of their bundles like paranoid dragons guarding hoards of stale bread and bent spoons. Others wrapped their cloaks tightly around their packs, hoping no one would try anything before the rooster crowed. Of course, the nobility did not suffer this indignity. If they had to travel, they brought an entourage, camped in relative comfort, or demanded their own chambers. Because nothing says privilege like not having to share a straw mattress with a man who hasn't bathed since Candlemas. But for everyone else, medieval sleeping was a team sport, awkward, itchy, and just public enough to make you wonder why humans ever thought the single bed was a good idea. Now that we've settled into the scratchy pallet, fluffed our symbolic straw pillow, and possibly elbowed a stranger in our sleep, it's time to dim the candlelight and descend into what medieval people feared most about bedtime. And no, it wasn't just lice. It was eternity. You see, in the modern world, bedtime might be a relaxing affair. A quick skincare routine, a podcast episode called Sleepy Frogs Whisper Shakespeare, and maybe one last peek at your phone for updates you'll forget by morning. But in the medieval mind, bedtime was a profoundly spiritual transaction. Not just sleep, but a possible dress rehearsal for death. Because let's face it, when your day involved exposure to fire, famine, infection, wolves, and wildly inaccurate medicine, the idea of not waking up was not just a possibility, it was almost a statistical inevitability. So before they surrendered to sleep, medieval folks didn't just fluff their hay. They prayed. And not casually either. These weren't gentle affirmations or guided meditations. These were soul-scrubbing, Latin mumbling, heaven-pleading prayers delivered with the urgency of someone trying to board the last lifeboat on the Titanic. One of the most common bedtime lines of the era? "If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take." Sweet, right? Like a lullaby for the apocalypse. It's basically the medieval version of saying, "Dear God, here's my soul. I hope you're awake because I might not be tomorrow." Children were encouraged to learn this early. Which, if you think about it, is both deeply spiritual and just a touch traumatic. Imagine being 5 and taught to say, "Amen, and in case I don't make it till morning, please collect me promptly." Comforting. But there was reason behind the nightly panic. Death could come quietly and without warning. Disease, fires, sudden chills, or falling beams from your thatched roof were all fair game. And since dying in a state of sin meant an express ticket to hell, the medieval sleeper needed to clear the slate before their head hit the straw. Hence, the bedtime routine became a spiritual security system. Confession was ideal. A few psalms for good measure. Perhaps a whispered apology to Saint Michael in case you'd forgotten him during Vespers. Some had specific prayers for plague, demonic attack, or unresolved guilt, like a medieval spiritual antivirus update. Others simply mumbled until their guilt faded or the rooster began its ominous pre-crow shuffle. For monks and nuns, this ritual was even more intense. Their day ended with compline, the final canonical hour of prayer before lights out. This wasn't just a quick kneel and nod. It was a formal communal ceremony, held in dark chapels lit by flickering candlelight, filled with chants, Latin invocations, and the soft sound of sandals on cold stone. It was haunting, beautiful, and just slightly terrifying, especially if Brother Gregory was known to snore during the Kyrie eleison. After compline, monks often observed the Great Silence, a vow of absolute quiet until morning. No speaking, no whispering, not even a, "Did you hear that hoof noise?" If you rolled over and bumped into someone, you were expected to groan spiritually and carry on. Children at home were also urged to pray, less out of discipline and more to distract them from the fact that the family goat sometimes slept next to them. And because parents told them angels were watching. Which sounds sweet until you realize it was less guardian angel and more celestial CCTV. But prayer wasn't the only nighttime concern. Once asleep, the medieval soul wasn't entirely at rest. You see, the mind may have shut down, but according to many, the soul wandered freely, and what it encountered mattered. Which brings us to dreams. We live in a world where dreams are often dismissed as psychological fluff, subconscious filing cabinets trying to organize your leftover thoughts, cheese-fueled chaos, or cryptic clues that you should probably stop rewatching Game of Thrones. But to the medieval mind, dreams were deeply meaningful. Sometimes terrifyingly so. Dreams weren't just dreams. They were messages, coded telegrams from God, angels, the devil, or the saint you'd forgotten to light a candle for. A dream of fire? Could be divine wrath. A dream of drowning? Might signal spiritual cleansing, or imminent pneumonia. A dream about a man with a goat's head juggling fish while reciting bad poetry? Time to wake up, repent, and maybe call a priest. Dream analysis wasn't a side hobby. It was a theological field. Entire texts were written to interpret dream symbols, much like medieval horoscopes, but with higher stakes. Theologians debated which dreams were divine revelations and which were demonic traps designed to lure you into sin via subconscious detours. And yes, that also meant dreaming something sinful, say stealing bread or smooching your neighbor's daughter, was taken seriously. Your dream self could be betraying your waking self. So naturally, some monks kept dream journals, noting holy visions or confessing scandalous sleep thoughts to their superiors. And occasionally being advised to eat fewer onions before bed. Even literature played along. Medieval stories often included long, elaborate dream sequences, full of angels, monsters, and allegorical beasts spouting metaphors about virtue. These weren't just dreams, they were spiritual experiences packaged as narrative interludes. Kind of like if Netflix ran a show where every episode was narrated by your guardian angel and ended with a confession scene. But dreams could also spell danger. The church, unsurprisingly, was wary. If you had too many wild or sexy dreams, it might mean your soul was under attack. Or that you'd slept too close to the chimney fumes. Either way, it was advised to fast, pray, and change your sheets. Yet for all the focus on dreams, the real fear of medieval sleep was what might happen while you were unconscious. And we're not talking about dying peacefully in your pallet. We're talking about sleepwalking. Now, in today's world, sleepwalking is considered a sleep disorder, an odd but mostly harmless act where your body briefly forgets the difference between dreams and reality. Maybe you make a sandwich. Maybe you mutter something strange. Maybe you wander into the hallway and scare your cat. In the Middle Ages? Different story. If someone stood up in the middle of the night, blank-eyed and mumbling, that wasn't harmless. That was possession, bewitchment, or demonic rehearsal. Accounts from the period describe sleepwalkers in chilling detail, people standing rigid, whispering in unknown tongues, climbing furniture, or, Perhaps most alarming, entering churches in their nightshirts. And in a society obsessed with sin, that was less quirky nocturnal stroll, and more better summon the bishop. Some believed sleepwalking was caused by imbalanced humors, especially an excess of black bile, the go-to medieval explanation for anything inconvenient. Others thought the soul had temporarily left the body, letting it wander like a ghost trying to finish its to-do list. Remedies? Oh yes. People tried herbs, prayers, and iron amulets. More extreme measures included tying one's leg to a bedpost, just in case you tried to climb onto the roof in your sleep and start confessing to crimes you hadn't committed. There were even discussions in some religious circles about whether a person could sin in their sleep. The answer? Sometimes. But sleepwalkers weren't the only thing to worry about. Medieval people also feared nighttime visitors of the supernatural kind. Demons, fairies, ghosts, witches, or wandering souls of the restless dead. Night, to them, was a thin veil between the living and the unknowable. Shadows had meaning. Whispers were warnings. And being alone? That was an invitation. Hence, another key reason most people didn't sleep solo. Not just for warmth but for spiritual defense. Having someone nearby meant witnesses. If you muttered something cursed, someone could wake you. If you stopped breathing, someone could pray. And if a demon tried to sneak into your dreams, at least your bedmate could elbow it in the metaphysical ribs. This fear was especially strong for children, who were seen as spiritually vulnerable. Parents kept them close not just for affection, but because fairy stealing and ghost whispering were not bedtime stories, they were warnings. So when a medieval person climbed into bed, surrounded by family, livestock, lice, prayers, and the occasional saint figurine, they weren't just going to sleep. They were preparing for battle. A battle against cold, fleas, spiritual decay, and whatever strange visions waited beyond the veil of dreams. It was a ritual, a rite, a risk. And if they made it to morning, they prayed again, just to be safe. So far, we've established that medieval sleep was anything but peaceful. You weren't alone. You weren't particularly clean. You were wrapped in fabric that itched, lying on bedding that scratched, surrounded by people who snored, muttered, or prayed audibly in Latin. And if that wasn't enough sensory delight, you were probably sharing your sleeping space with animals. Yes, animals. Now, in today's world, sharing a bed with a pet is usually a lifestyle choice. You let your dog curl up near your feet or your cat burrow into your side because it's cozy. Sometimes inconvenient, always adorable. But in the Middle Ages, this wasn't a quirky TikTok trend. It was a survival tactic. Let's begin with architecture. Medieval homes, especially those of the lower classes, were essentially one-room huts made of timber, stone, mud, and hope. The floors were often dirt. The roofs leaked. And insulation was a fantasy. Winters were brutal. Central heating? That was your family pig. That's right. In peasant households, the line between human and livestock living space was less a line and more a vague suggestion. Chickens wandered freely, pecking at crumbs and sometimes making themselves at home under the pallet. Dogs curled up near the fire, or more accurately in the warmest human lap they could find. Cows and goats might be kept just inside the doorway, especially in colder months, to protect them from predators and frost. And yes, sometimes they slept in the same bed as their human companions. Before you recoil in modern horror, let's break it down. Animals produced heat. And body heat was precious. A large dog curled at your feet might be the only thing keeping your toes from turning purple in January. A pig, yes, an actual pig, was essentially a walking radiator. And while they didn't make great conversationalists, they were warm, generally non-judgmental, and unlikely to criticize your snoring. Of course, there were drawbacks. Animals don't respect personal space. A chicken might decide your chest was an excellent roost. A dog might steal your portion of blanket. And pigs? Let's just say they're not known for their delicate scent profiles. But when the wind howled through the cracks in your wall and your fire dwindled to a lonely ember, you didn't care who, or what, you were sleeping beside. In wealthier homes, this arrangement was less common. Nobles didn't typically snuggle with goats, though small lap dogs were fashionable and sometimes allowed in bed, not for heat but for status. Some castles even had dedicated pet quarters, Tiny chambers just for favored hounds or falcons, because nothing says medieval opulence like a dog with a fireplace and embroidered pillow. Still, the principle remained. Warmth above dignity. Comfort over pride. In a world without space heaters or double glazing, any heat source was a blessing, even if it had hooves. But animals weren't the only thing crowding the medieval bedroom. If you lived in a monastery, your sleeping companions were dozens of other monks, each tucked into a narrow bed, wrapped in modest robes, and trying very hard not to fart loudly during prayer hour. Let's talk about monastic dormitories, or as I like to call them, ascetic IKEA nightmares. Unlike peasants, monks had rooms, but that word is doing some heavy lifting. A monastic dormitory was typically a large, echoey hall filled with wooden planks and silence. Beds were simple. A wooden board, maybe a thin straw mattress if the abbot was feeling festive. You slept fully clothed, not out of modesty, but because you had to wake up at 2 a.m. for prayers and no one had invented fleecy pajamas yet. Pillows? Optional. Blankets? Scratchy. Privacy? Hilariously non-existent. Beds were lined up like penitential sardines, and the expectation was clear. No talking, no moving, no sinning. If you rolled over and bumped your neighbor, you apologized telepathically and hoped they didn't report you for improper slumber conduct. The rule of Saint Benedict, which governed many monasteries, emphasized obedience, silence, and spiritual discipline. Sleep was not a reward. It was a necessity, granted in strict moderation and not to be enjoyed. The body was a vehicle and comfort was a detour. Some particularly pious monks even slept sitting up, back against a cold wall, robes wrapped tightly, hood drawn down like a penitential hoodie. Why? Because lying down too flat looked suspiciously like being dead. And being dead in your sleep might confuse God. Or tempt a demon. Or worse, invite dreams. Yes, dreams again. To the truly devout, dreams were dangerous. They could inspire sinful thoughts. So some monks avoided deep sleep altogether by propping themselves up or even resting on wooden benches. This was spiritual training, a way to keep the soul alert by keeping the body just uncomfortable enough to avoid REM. But why all this nocturnal suffering? The answer is one of the strangest and most fascinating traditions in Christian monasticism. Matins. Matins was the first canonical hour of the day, and by day, we mean middle of the night. Typically held around 2 o'clock or 3 a.m., Matins was a candlelit service full of chanting, psalms, and the ghostly echo of sandal-covered feet shuffling through ancient stone. The idea was noble: sacrifice comfort by dedicating the most silent, most sacred part of the night to God. It was also excruciating. Imagine being jolted awake by a bell, stumbling into a freezing chapel, and trying not to fall asleep mid-chant. In fact, some monks did fall asleep, and were promptly punished with extra prayers or chores. Fell asleep during Matins? Congrats. You're leading the next one. But even if you weren't a monk, sleeping through the night was never guaranteed. Because medieval life was noisy. We tend to imagine the past as tranquil. No cars, no sirens, no late-night delivery drones. But medieval people slept through bells, storms, livestock screams, and the occasional siege. Let's start with church bells. These weren't delicate little chimes. These were enormous iron monsters rung by hand, marking every major event: sunrise, noon, vespers, curfews, weddings, deaths, and of course the dreaded midnight prayer alarms. If you lived near a monastery, your sleep schedule was ruled by bells. Over time, your brain would just adapt. The bells became white noise, the sacred equivalent of a YouTube rain video, except it yelled at you to get up and confess your sins. And then there were storms. Thunder in the medieval world wasn't just weather. It was often interpreted as divine wrath. Lightning meant someone somewhere had made a very bad decision, and the heavens were staging an intervention. Roofs leaked, walls trembled, and windows rattled like haunted maracas. Still, people slept through it. They had to. Life didn't pause for insomnia. If you were a peasant, you needed to wake before dawn, work till sundown, and still have the strength to pray. There was no time for luxurious tossing and turning. Even during disasters, sleep happened. There are records of people sleeping through barn fires, earthquakes, and even Viking raids. During the Black Death, carts rolled through villages collecting bodies. Some people never stirred. Not because they were callous, but because exhaustion was deeper than fear. In the darkest nights, sleep became a kind of refuge. A brief escape from hunger, grief, and terror. People literally slept off heartbreak, curled beneath coarse blankets, murmuring prayers, and hoping the world would feel slightly less cursed in the morning. And in some cases, sleep was a choice of defiance. When the world around you was filled with loss, war, famine, sickness, sometimes the most rebellious thing you could do was close your eyes and rest anyway. It was a gesture of faith, of hope, or just pure exhaustion. So yes, medieval people slept with animals, sat upright, woke for prayers, dozed through chaos, and somehow made it through the night. Because sleep for them wasn't about luxury. It was about endurance. And maybe, just maybe, waking up. By now, it should be clear that medieval people weren't sleeping in peace. They were sleeping in peril. We've covered straw pallets, shared mattresses, livestock bed warmers, and the 2 a.m. prayer service that turned dreams into spiritual cardio. But if you thought the worst thing that could happen in a medieval bed was a snoring cousin or a misbehaving goat, brace yourself. Because the real horrors? They were smaller, itchier, hungrier. Welcome to the infestation chapter. Let's begin with the trinity of torment: fleas, lice, and the ever-dramatic bed bug. If medieval beds had mascots, these little creatures would be on the family crest. They were everywhere. In straw mattresses, in tunics, in hair, in the wood grain of your bed frame. There was no such thing as pest control. If it bit, you scratched. If it crawled, you flinched. If it laid eggs in your bedding, you shrugged and hoped they didn't hatch all at once. And no, this wasn't limited to peasants. Even nobles, yes, the feather bed sleeping, curtain canopy having aristocracy, were not exempt. Their satin sheets, as luxurious as they were, also made excellent pest nesting zones. Because fleas don't care about class and lice don't check titles. In fact, some wealthier households had servants dedicated to nitpicking, literally. These individuals were hired to comb through their master's hair looking for lice, plucking them with grim determination and the kind of focus normally reserved for brain surgery or needlepoint. Imagine applying for that job. Experience, expert in scalp surveillance. Strong fingers, comfortable with vermin. Now let's talk about bed bugs, those sneaky, silent vampires of the night. Bed bugs in medieval homes lived in the seams of mattresses, the cracks in wooden frames, and sometimes even in stone walls. They waited until the lights were out, if you were lucky enough to have had lights, and then emerged to feast on whatever human flesh was within crawling distance. No one slept through a bed bug attack. You didn't fight them. You just endured. Nightcaps weren't just to keep your head warm, they were part of a medieval bug defense system. People slept fully clothed for the same reason. Less exposed skin meant fewer bites. And the solutions? Ranged from the practical to the desperate. Some people burned strong-smelling herbs like wormwood, tansy, or thyme in the hopes of fumigating their sleeping area. Others went to bed with garlic cloves, onions, or even ashes tucked under the sheets. These methods were, let's say, inconsistently effective. But they did have the side benefit of ensuring you wouldn't be accidentally cuddled by anyone. Hygiene, as you've probably guessed, was not a medieval strong suit. Bathing was rare. Laundry was even rarer. And soap, when it existed, was often made from things that were better left unnamed. Bodies were scrubbed occasionally when time, water, and piety aligned. Hair was rinsed maybe. Clothes were beaten with sticks or soaked in lye when the smell became actively spiritual. In the meantime, everyone just got used to it. But beyond the physical discomfort, pests also carried moral meaning. Fleas and lice weren't just a nuisance. They were interpreted as symbols of sin, reminders of human fallibility and the fall of man. You weren't just being bitten, you were being spiritually nudged to get your life together. Medieval poets even wrote love poems about fleas. And no, that wasn't a typo. There are actual verses where the poet thanks a flea for biting both him and his lover, making it a sort of romantic parasite that unites our blood and hearts as one. Medieval courtship was, shall we say, adventurous. But physical torment wasn't the only nighttime fear. Let's shift gears, from crawling bugs to wandering souls. Because medieval people weren't just afraid of what lived in their beds. They were afraid of what they themselves might become in their sleep. Enter sleepwalking. Today, sleepwalking is seen as a quirky sleep disorder. Harmless mostly. Maybe you end up in the kitchen holding a spatula and wondering why your toes are wet. Maybe you've whispered weird things into the dark and then pretended it never happened. Embarrassing? Yes. Dangerous? Occasionally. But possessed by demons? Not usually. Unless you were medieval. In the Middle Ages, sleepwalking wasn't funny. It was terrifying. If someone got up in the middle of the night, eyes open but unseeing, muttering in an unknown tongue and stepping over livestock, this wasn't chalked up to stress. It was evidence of possession, bewitchment, or some kind of soul detachment. You weren't just sleepwalking. You were channeling something. Something dark. Something that probably wanted to set the barn on fire or steal holy relics. And remember, this was a society where unexplained behavior often led to public trials or exorcisms. Accounts from the time describe sleepwalkers as moon-touched or blessed by shadow, which sounds like a cool fantasy novel title but in reality meant your neighbors might throw salt at you or call for the village priest. Theories for why sleepwalking happened ranged from the absurd to the horrifying. Some said it was caused by imbalanced bodily humors, especially too much black bile, which medieval people blamed for everything from melancholy to flatulence. Others believed that during sleep, the soul exited the body, leaving it vulnerable to manipulation either by devils, witches, or astral meddling. To protect sleepwalkers and their families, people took extreme measures. Some tried herbs. Others whispered protection prayers over the sleeping person's head. Some even tied the person to the bedpost, not out of cruelty, but to keep them from walking into the fireplace or accidentally wandering into the village well. Which, to be fair, was a valid concern. There are reports of sleepwalkers climbing onto rooftops, mumbling church hymns, or trying to open imaginary doors. All of which were seen as deeply concerning behaviors. Particularly because, let's be honest, there weren't many safe places in a medieval home to stumble around half-conscious in a nightshirt with no pants. And if you sleepwalked into a church? That was the spiritual equivalent of breaking and entering. Some towns treated it as a sign that you were either chosen by God or very much not. Either way, someone was getting holy water thrown at them. One particularly tragic belief was that a sleepwalker could sin during sleep. That's right. You could be held morally accountable for something your unconscious body did. Which, if applied today, would mean a lot more confessions starting with, "Forgive me, Father, for what I mumbled last Thursday at 3 a.m. Sleepwalkers weren't the only ones viewed with suspicion. Anyone who twitched, talked, or acted oddly during sleep could be accused of being spiritually vulnerable. Parents told their children to say their prayers, not just to protect themselves, but to prevent the devil from sneaking in while they dreamed. The idea that you were more spiritually exposed at night permeated nearly every aspect of medieval sleep culture. It's why people avoided sleeping alone. Why bedrooms were filled with crosses, saints' tokens, dried herbs, and sometimes iron blades hidden under pillows. Night wasn't safe. Darkness wasn't neutral. The line between dreams and damnation was paper thin. So when people went to bed, they weren't just seeking rest. They were entering a battlefield. And each creak of the wood, each whisper of wind through the shutters, each involuntary twitch of a sleeping limb, could be something else. Something watching. Something waiting. Which is why morning, waking up alive, unpossessed, and mostly unbitten, wasn't just a relief. It was a victory. By the late 17th century, the European world had shifted. Castles had given way to colonies, monasteries to meeting houses, and goats in the bed had, mercifully, been replaced by feather ticking and strict Protestant schedules. But while the setting had changed, the fear of night, the distrust of dreams, and the spiritual paranoia that had haunted medieval beds, those remained. Nowhere did these fears fester more violently than in a small Puritan settlement on the edge of the New World, Salem, Massachusetts. This is where our story darkens. Because what had once been individual prayers whispered before sleep would soon transform into public accusations, rigid courtrooms, and gallows silhouetted by rising dawn. But first, some context. The Puritans, those fiercely devout settlers who built Salem, were spiritual descendants of the medieval mindset. They believed in demons, devils, and a personal God who was always watching, especially at night. Sleep, to the Puritan mind, was not merely rest. It was a spiritual checkpoint. And dreams? Still risky business. While modernity had crept in elsewhere, Salem in the 1690s remained deeply suspicious of anything unexplained. Life was hard. The winters were brutal. The crops failed. The wolves still howled in the woods. And unlike the bustling cities of Europe, Salem was isolated, a pressure cooker of suspicion, piety, and long-simmering grudges. Then in 1692 that pressure cooker boiled over. It began, fittingly, in the quiet hours of night. Inside the home of Reverend Samuel Parris, where two young girls, Betty Parris, age 9, and her cousin Abigail Williams, age 11, began to experience strange episodes. They screamed. They fell into silent trances. They contorted their bodies in unnatural ways. And most hauntingly, they claimed they were being pinched, bitten, and tormented by invisible forces. These weren't just tantrums. In a society that believed the devil was a prowling reality, these episodes were viewed with soul-deep terror. Unable to explain the behavior, and increasingly frightened himself, Reverend Parris summoned Dr. William Griggs, the town's only physician. After examining the girls and finding no natural cause, Griggs delivered the diagnosis that would change everything. The evil hand is upon them. In other words, witchcraft. Suddenly, the spiritual fears that once lived quietly beside firelit beds exploded into the public square. If the minister's own household could be infected with satanic forces, no one was safe. And if children were having night visions, dreamlike torments, and invisible encounters, it wasn't imagination, it was the devil himself. The girls began to speak. They named names. First, it was Sarah Good, a homeless beggar who muttered to herself when turned away from doors. Then Sarah Osborne, a woman who hadn't attended church regularly and had scandalously remarried a servant. And most infamously, Tituba, the enslaved woman of African and Caribbean descent who had lived in the Paris home. Her foreign stories, rituals, and accent made her a convenient target. Under pressure, likely physical abuse, Tituba confessed. But she didn't stop there. She claimed to have seen a tall man in black, a book of signatures, and other witches working with her. Her confession wasn't just sensational, it was expansive. She opened the floodgates. The result? A community where nightmares became court evidence, where sleepwalking might be proof of possession, and where dreams were interrogated in court. Because in Salem, spectral evidence, testimony about visions, dreams, and unseen forces, was considered admissible in trial. Imagine this. A witness claims they saw your spirit choking them in a dream. You were miles away at the time? Doesn't matter. Dreams were real, and your soul might have traveled on devilish errands while your body slept. It didn't take long before the accusations outpaced reality. Old grudges resurfaced as holy crusades. A dying cow? Clearly a witch's curse. A child crying during scripture? Must be the devil whispering through the rafters. In a matter of weeks, dozens were accused. What had started as nighttime behavior, screaming in bed, visions during sleep, midnight muttering, became death sentences. And this fear wasn't abstract. The trials were very real. Held in Salem town, they quickly devolved into a theater of hysteria. The accused were paraded into court in shackles, their sleep habits, personalities, and dreams examined as though on trial themselves. The afflicted girls convulsed and gasped on cue, pointing at invisible specters. If you looked at them, they screamed. If you didn't look at them, they screamed louder. And every performance was taken as proof. There were no defense attorneys. You stood alone. If you confessed, you might be spared so long as you named someone else. The result was a cascade of accusations. One dream led to 10 arrests. One witch's mark, a mole, a birthmark, a scar, became a divine fingerprint of guilt. By June of 1692, the first execution took place. Her name was Bridget Bishop, a woman known for dressing in red, running a tavern, and not quite fitting the mold of what a Puritan woman should be. She was hanged on Gallows Hill. 18 more would follow. One man, Giles Corey, refused to plead. For that, he was pressed to death under stones. His final words, whispered through blood, were, "More weight, By the end of the hysteria, over 200 people had been accused, many of them jailed in horrific conditions. At least 5 died in prison. 19 were executed and countless others were scarred for life, mentally, spiritually, socially. And yet, most of the accusations started with dreams. With visions seen at night or symptoms that would today be called seizures, trauma, or stress responses. But in the world of Salem, those signs weren't medical. They were supernatural. In a way, the Salem Witch Trials were the final act of medieval sleep culture. The last great public reckoning of a society that believed night was dangerous, that dreams had meaning, and that the devil did his best work between dusk and dawn. But the trials, like all fevered dreams, eventually broke. When Governor William Phipps's wife was accused, the absurdity of the situation reached the elite. He disbanded the court of Oyer and Terminer. Public sentiment shifted. Spectral evidence was banned. The afflicted girls grew silent. Confessions stopped. The gallows quieted. And Salem at last woke up. But it didn't wake whole. The village had torn itself apart, all because what happened in the dark had been treated as truth. Because the line between dreams and demons had been believed, without question. Years later, some of the accusers recanted. One, Ann Putnam Jr., publicly apologized for her role in the trials, claiming she had been deluded by Satan. Judge Samuel Sewell, who had presided over many of the executions, stood in church and read a confession aloud, begging forgiveness. But for the victims it was too late. The scars remained. On the town. On its history. On the fragile trust between neighbors who had once shared meals, and later accused each other of murder in the night. Today we speak of witch hunts as metaphors. But in Salem they were real. They started in bedrooms with cries in the night. With sleepwalkers. With children who couldn't explain their pain. With dreams turned into courtroom confessions. So when we talk about medieval sleep culture, we're not just talking about straw beds and nightcaps. We're talking about a world where rest was never truly safe, where a bad dream could get you killed, and where sleep was seen not as escape, but as exposure. Sleep, in the medieval and early modern world, was a gamble. And in Salem that gamble cost lives. When the gavel finally dropped on Salem's last trial and the gallows were disassembled plank by plank, the world did not immediately shake itself clean of the horror. You might imagine that, with the end of the trials, reason would have returned like a morning sun spilling across the cobbled streets of Massachusetts. But collective trauma doesn't evaporate with logic. And fear of the night, deeply planted over centuries, did not go quietly. In fact, it followed us. Into literature, superstition, psychology, and even science. Let's begin with language. Many of the words we use today to talk about fear and suspicion have their roots in these shadowy centuries. Ever heard of someone being under suspicion? That expression has eerie origins in spiritual paranoia, where someone's behavior, particularly what they did when no one was watching, like at night, placed them metaphorically beneath a cloud of scrutiny. The witching hour, that spooky term for the late night period between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m., was born in the same fear-drenched era. It was said to be the time when witches were most active, when demons whispered and the veil between worlds thinned. Even nightmare, a word we now use for bad dreams, originally meant something quite different. The mare wasn't a bad dream, it was a demon, a spectral creature who sat on your chest while you slept, choking you with invisible weight. The term, sleep paralysis, had not yet entered the lexicon. So if you awoke unable to move, gasping for breath, perhaps after a troubling dream, well, clearly something had been sitting on you. And sometimes you could see it. In artwork from the 15th to the 18th centuries, these nightmares were often depicted as grotesque goblins, crouched on sleeping bodies, often with a pale horse lurking in the shadows, a pun on mare. These paintings weren't meant to be fantastical. They were interpretive diagnosis. A visual capture of a real experience, filtered through centuries of belief that something lived in the dark. Even today, remnants of that belief creep into the way we describe emotions. Haunted by regret. Wrestling with inner demons. Losing sleep over it. They're not just metaphors. They're echoes. But the night fears didn't only infiltrate our language. They influenced our laws. In the years after Salem, American legal systems gradually moved away from accepting dreams and visions as testimony. The backlash against spectral evidence was fierce. In 1693, Massachusetts passed a law requiring that evidence in witchcraft trials be grounded in fact, a novelty for the time. It marked the beginning of a slow shift toward empirical thinking, though not everyone got the memo. Still, even as dreams were banned from the courtroom, they remained on the page. Enter literature. The Gothic genre, the grandparent of horror fiction, was practically built from the soot and whispers of medieval bedrooms. Writers like Edgar Allan Poe, Mary Shelley, and later Bram Stoker were obsessed with sleep, dreams, and what lies beneath the pillow. Shelley claimed the idea for Frankenstein came to her in a dream. Poe's characters regularly descend into madness through disturbed sleep. In The Telltale Heart, guilt prevents the narrator from sleeping, until the sound of a heartbeat, or is it, drives him to confess. Stoker's Dracula features hypnotic sleepwalking, nighttime visitations, and the haunting vulnerability of unconsciousness. These authors understood what medieval people had always believed. When we sleep, we are not safe. Not from others. Not from ourselves. Their works became a way to process cultural memory, to translate centuries of dread into stories that could be consumed rather than endured. Meanwhile, in the real world, sleep disorders began to attract attention, not from priests but from physicians. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the field of neurology was slowly emerging. People were still frightened by sleepwalking, night terrors, and sudden death during slumber, but now instead of chalking it up to Satan, doctors looked inward, into the brain, into the body, into science. And yet, the mysticism never fully disappeared. The 19th century medical literature is filled with strange hybrids, texts that describe somnambulism, sleepwalking, with clinical precision, then wander into metaphysics. Hypnotism, for instance, was viewed as a kind of waking dream, a state where the soul was loosened but not entirely freed. It was both therapy and seance. And dreams themselves were still hotly debated. Were they random? Were they messages? Were they psychological residues or cosmic signals? Then came Freud. Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, published The Interpretation of Dreams in 1899. In it, he proposed that dreams were wish fulfillment, a window into the unconscious mind. Suddenly, all those nightmares weren't demonic, they were desires, fears, memories squirming into visibility under the cover of REM. But even Freud couldn't fully despook the night. As science advanced, it began to confirm what medieval people had always known in their bones. Sleep is not simple. We now know of disorders like night terrors, REM behavior disorder, parasomnias, narcolepsy, and of course sleep paralysis, which may account for many of those historical accounts of invisible demons sitting on the chest. The neurological origins are clear. But the experience? Still unnerving. And it's not just individuals who suffer. Entire cultures still respond to night fears with ritual. In Philippine folklore, there's the Bangangat, a deadly sleep demon that kills by inducing terrifying dreams. In Nigeria, the Ogun Oru is blamed for sleep paralysis and midnight distress. In Thailand, Phaim is said to sit on your chest during sleep. Sound familiar? It should. The same creature that medieval villagers blamed for stealing breath has traveled through time and translation, taking on new names but never quite leaving. Even today, in a hyperdigital, overlit world, we hang on to sleep rituals like lifelines. We meditate, play white noise, light candles, whisper affirmations. Some people tuck crystals under their pillows. Others wear sleep-tracking headbands. Many keep a night light on, not because they're afraid of bumping into the wall, but because some quiet part of them still remembers when darkness had teeth. Sleep apps now offer guided meditations for easing the fear of death. They don't call it that, of course. They say things like, let go of the day, or drift away without worry. But at the root of it, they're still trying to soothe that ancient part of the brain that once knelt by a straw mattress and prayed, if I should die before I wake. We're still fighting the same fears. Only now, instead of reciting Latin psalms, we scroll through ASMR playlists. So what did we learn? We learned that sleep is not neutral. It never was. It's not just when your eyes close. It's when your soul opens. When your mind wanders into places you didn't plan to visit. It's when truth becomes slippery and symbols rise to the surface like bubbles in a pond. In the medieval world, this space was terrifying. In the modern world, it still is. Sure, we've traded lice for memory foam. We've replaced the rooster with a vibrating alarm. But the fear remains. It lingers. It curls up at the foot of the bed like a shadow that knows your name. And maybe that's okay. Because fear teaches us to be humble. To respect the mysteries we can't control. To understand that rest is not something we take. It's something we survive. Sleep is not an escape. It's a journey. Through darkness. Through memory. Through fear. And when we wake, we are reborn. Every single time. And so we arrive at the edge of night. We've wandered through smoky cottages and stone monasteries, climbed into straw-filled pallets beside pigs, whispered prayers against invisible demons, and stood beneath the gallows of Salem as sleep turned suspicion into death. We've followed dreams across centuries, tracked nightmares through theology and science, and watched sleep become both a battleground and a bomb. What, then, have we been chasing? Perhaps the question isn't how medieval people slept, but why they kept trying. Because night in every era has been more than darkness. It's been the unknowable, stretched out in velvet silence. In sleep, the body rests but the self dissolves. Kings and beggars, monks and mothers, all stripped of identity, status, and control, slipping into a place that is both death's cousin and birth's quiet rehearsal. And what did our ancestors do in the face of this mystery? They fought it. They feared it. They ritualized it. And sometimes they made peace with it. They tucked iron blades beneath pillows, burned herbs, murmured sacred words. They watched over each other's bodies in dim dormitories. They called out to saints and screamed when dreams felt too real. They believed that sleeping poorly meant sin, and that sleeping too well meant something was watching. It's easy to mock this now. Easy to laugh at the idea of night demons or 2 a.m. prayer bells. But can we really say we've evolved past it? We still track our sleep like it's a competition. We still invent gadgets to soothe what lullabies once calmed. We still fear waking at 3 a.m., sitting in silence with our thoughts, wondering if something, anything, is trying to get in. Somewhere deep in the part of our brain that remembers firelight and wolves, we still know. The night is not empty. It's never been empty. But maybe it doesn't have to be feared. Because in sleep there is also grace. In the helplessness there is trust. In the letting go there is a kind of faith, not in gods or ghosts but in ourselves, in the belief that we'll close our eyes and somehow, impossibly, wake again. Night after night we surrender. And morning after morning we rise. Isn't that the most incredible thing? Not the sleeping but the waking. The return. The soft re-entry from a private world no one else will ever visit with us. So the next time you fluff your pillow and pull the blanket up to your chin, remember them. The monks who hummed chants in the cold. The mothers who curled around their children and hoped the rats would stay away. The villagers who dreamt of dancing, even as plagues took the next house over. The thinkers, the sinners, the saints, all of them asleep under the same moon we now take selfies with. And remember this. To sleep is to risk yourself. To wake is to begin again. And to do this over and over for a lifetime? That is the most human story ever told. Good night.